Okay. I wonder if the ranks are thinning. I think we have some other people who were here last semester. I think one or two other. I got a message from one of the students there in the university in the U.S. They asked me some questions about the as an assignment that they're doing for their class there. They asked for some questions. They wanted to know my thoughts on foreign companies trying to do business in Japan. So that was his, apparently one of his first assignments in the university in the U.S. Certainly we miss having those other grad students here, but they're off to the U.S. And we're going to talk today about market power and monopoly. And what I'm going to do, if you notice, I don't know if you got my second. I sent a second version. It's quite different from the first one I sent, the first several pages. So just with that in mind, I went over this last night. I went over the example that I had, and sometimes you look at something carefully again. I look at my work and say, something about it I didn't really like. I didn't think it was a good explanation, so I've changed it. And what I've done is I want to give a what happens. What's misallocation of resources is the title, but I'm going to talk about a very simple model, just a very simple model to give a sense of what happens in an economy when with monopoly. What is the impact on that? So what I've done is I've just made a very simple model, a two-good economy, goods X and Y, and they're produced using labor and capital. Initially, we have initial conditions under perfect competition. Perfect competition, we know that firms are price takers in both inputs and output markets, and they can only control the quantity of their output. Also, we're going to assume that labor experiences declining marginal revenue product in both industries X and Y. That just means simply as the amount of labor that's used, the marginal revenue product falls, and that would be at the firm level. I'm fixing the price of capital as exogenous. I don't just to simplify the model. I'm making that outside of the economy, and that it's fixed so that the price. How do I have that? The price K at PK. Is fixed. I have that here, PK. So that price is fixed. That's one that is just simply we're simply assuming that that is a perfectly competitive market for capital, and it comes from outside of this economy. Households are identical and have identical utility functions. They look like this. That C means the additional under perfect competition. So that's some utility X and Y. They get out of consuming the two goods. And this economy, we assume it's in equilibrium, and the initial equilibrium prices are that's the price of in perfect competition. The C means here means perfect competition of good X. There's the price in perfect competition of Y, the price of labor under perfect competition, fixed price of capital, the amount of labor used in industry X under perfect competition, the amount of labor used in Y under perfect competition. Even though the price of capital is fixed, you can vary the usage of capital. We assume that's the amount of capital used in industry X, capital used in industry Y output of good X under perfect competition, output of Y under perfect competition. Actually, this I'm going to take that out. That's not correct. This is the utility function. That's not. You look at that. That's the utility of X and utility. I don't want that. That should look like this. Basically, what we have is just we're not specifying anything other than just saying that's an economy and they have those prices. We're not really worried what the prices are. It's just at equilibrium. It's some market in equilibrium or some economy in equilibrium, and all the firms satisfy the firms satisfy this relationship of the marginal revenue product of capital, the price of capital, marginal revenue product of labor, the price of labor under perfect competition. The marginal utility of X, the household equilibrium condition is there. So it's just an economy that's there. Oh, and also, of course, the amount of labor is fixed. So the amount of labor in both industries adds up to some overall fixed amount. So that's what we have at the start, and what we have is happiness. There's lots and lots of happiness in this world, and it's all in equilibrium, and people have wonderful utility, and then huge utility, I might add. And then comes some evil prince into the realm, into the country, and takes over. We're going to assume that some monopolist comes in and takes over Industry X. Takes over Industry X and has some monopoly power, market power in Industry X. And we say, well, what's going to happen? What impact does that have on an economy? Well, we know it operates as a monopolist in its output market. In the monopolist equilibrium conditions are that it reduces its quantity. That's what we found out last week. That what monopolists do is they reduce. Monopolists produce less under monopoly. That's the quantity under monopoly of good X that's produced by the monopolist is less than the market would produce under perfect competition. So that's obvious. And the reason is that the price under monopoly for good X that the monopolist produce is greater than under perfect competition. And we saw that in class last week. We showed the graph. Oh, and I did. There was a question just before we get started on that. I just wanted to. No, I'll cover that at the end of the class. There was the question about graphics. I'll talk about that at the end of the class. So let's see. So that we assume that the output level, this QM of X, and output price PM of X, produces positive economic profits for the firm. So the firm charges that, and they earn. That is they earn above normal profits. So the firm earns above normal profits doing that, and so under. So if you have some equilibrium, the firm, the monopolist is in equilibrium. They set their price. They create for themselves their profit maximizing equilibrium. And so the following must be true. So they're using. That means if they're producing less, then they have to use less labor. They use less labor in order to produce. So the thing is we remember is that the price of labor is fixed. There's a certain amount of labor in this economy. It's fixed. So if this firm is using less labor, if they're using less labor, then the price of if they're using less labor, then there's more labor. They've increased the amount of labor for industry-wide. There's more labor out there. It's got to go somewhere. Those workers have to go somewhere. They go and work in industry-wide. But we know in industry-wide that because there's downward sloping marginal revenue curve, then the marginal revenue product curve, then that industry, if there's more labor goes in, it's less productive. It's less productive, and there's lower, so it lowers the wage. So the wage is lower in industry Y. So the amount of, so the following must be true. That here, what these two statements mean, that the firm, the monopolist, uses less capital and less labor than under perfect competition. They just use less. They shrink the size of the industry. The price goes up. The amount of labor used drops. The amount of capital they use drops. So now capital, it doesn't matter because that the capital is exogenous, but labor is inside the economy, so that we remember that these are fixed. Then the labor of the monopolist in industry X plus the labor under this still perfect competition in industry Y, with the monopolist in industry X, is still fixed, which means that the labor used under perfect competition in industry Y with the monopolist is greater than under perfect competition. So there's more labor. So labor, as I said, declining marginal revenue product. So the marginal revenue product of labor under industry X is greater because there's less labor. There's less labor, and the marginal revenue product of labor in industry Y under the monopolist, that's greater, and this is less. So it's less. So at least initially, the price of the price of labor for the monopolist is greater than because there's still there's still a price taker. So the marginal revenue product is higher for the monopolist for labor in industry X, and it's also greater than, at least initially, than the price of labor in industry Y. The one is going down. The amount of labor in industry X has gone in this direction. It's gone higher. The amount of that X, the amount of Y has increased. So initially it's equal. Now the wage in industry X is higher, but the firm is still earning monopoly profit. So that is the situation. But we know that that's ultimately not in equilibrium. So since wages are higher in industry X than industry Y as a result of the monopolist action, labor should have the incentive to flow to industry X. The monopolist says that they should flow to industry. So the labor says, well, I want to come and work there. You're paying a higher wage. He says, yeah, but I don't want any more. I don't need any more labor. So that's the story. So that but the monopolist has an incentive to maintain this condition. The monopolist needs to use less labor in equilibrium than in the perfect competition, because that's what they reduce their output. So that's what makes the price higher and gives them above normal profits. So that's the story. That's the story that we're telling as to how the firm, the monopolist, has above normal profits. They've reduced their quantity of labor used. They're dumping labor into the other market. But in equilibrium, it must be true that they should equalize anyway. That wages must fall in industry X relative to industry Y in order to achieve that condition. And so that's done. How does that happen? Somehow there has to be an adjustment. So there has to be an adjustment that takes place. We have a monopolist. The monopolist has reduced the output. It's raised the price of their good. They've reduced their labor. They've dumped labor into the market for Y, which is driving the wages down in Y. Okay, so what? So in an equilibrium, there still has to equalize. Well, what's going to happen? What happens in the demand functions for households, if the wages fall if the wages fall, well, the demand curve shifts to the left. So that's what's going to happen, is that the wages are going to fall and the demand curve shifts. The demand curve shifts to the left, so that demand falls, so that the demand can reflect the price of and the way that I think that this would happen in this model. Again, I'm not putting any numbers. I'm just this is kind of a conceptual. This is your kind of basic, the basic model. And I think what's happening, what would happen mathematically, is that the firms would then reduce the amount of capital. They would make they would shrink the amount of capital they use, which would make the firms less productive. So that the wages fall. So that the following so that either one or both of these must be true, that the capital used by the monopolist in Industry X is less than the capital that's used under perfect competition, and or that the capital used in Industry Y under the monopolist condition is less than the amount of capital used under a perfect competition. So the amount of the capital in the economy must decline, meaning that the productivity of labor must decline. So the result is lower wages and lower utility levels. Now the monopolist is fine because the monopolist is earning positive economic profits. See, that's the point here, is that the monopolist is fine with this, because even though the economy is shrinking, where before, under perfect competition, everybody's just earning normal zero economic profits, where under this situation, the monopolist is earning positive economic profit. So I think that this is they have an incentive to keep this situation. It's kind of a game theory kind of approach, a little bit of a game approach that I'm using. We're going to talk a little bit more about game theory a little bit later in the class, but I'm also introducing a little bit of an idea about games and game theory here. But so the monopolist earns positive economic profits, and I don't believe has an incentive to keep it to actually allow the economy to shrink. So the result of this is that utilities at the end, as a result of the monopolist, is that the marginal is that the total utility level under the monopolist of X and Y is less than under the perfect competition. That's going to be the main thing, and that wages, the price of labor under the monopolist condition is less than under perfect competition. so that's going to be. I think we just put that. The wages are lower, utilities are lower, consumption is lower, but the monopolist is earning positive profits. So that the monopolist has the incentive. That's the incentive for the monopolist to do that. So that just gives you an idea. This is the kind of thing that you can often do in economics. You come up with some kind of a general model that kind of gives you an idea of some of the dynamics, and then if you want, you can take and put the math in and actually make mathematical specification and calculate it out. But I'm not. I'm not doing that here. I just want to conceptually give you the idea. But that's the basic idea. That's something that you would expect to have in an economy. If you have an economy, a two-good economy, and one of them becomes a monopoly, that this is the kind of outcome. An outcome, something like this, is what you should expect. That in fact, that in the end, utilities are lower for the households, but the monopolist is happy with this situation. Otherwise, everybody else is less happy. So the previous happy valley has now become a place of misery and grief. But anyway, that is the idea, the general idea of the effect of a monopolist. And so what I'll do now is just introduce some of the, first off, to give you an overall of some of the forms of what are called industrial organization. Industrial organization. That's a term that means how industries are organized. Industrial organization is how industries are organized competitively. Perfect competition is a form of industrial organization. That's a form of industrial organization. But imperfect competition, there's three main forms of industrial organization. One is monopolies. Of course, we just talked about monopolies. The second is oligopolies. Monopolies, one. Mono, one. Oligopoly is from the Greek. It means few. It means industries with a few firms. And then the third one, and you see that a lot. We see there are some monopolies, but oligopolies are probably more common. And as we'll find out, we'll be looking at specific examples in the Japanese economy of the organization of how industries are organized. And we'll find that there's quite many industries are oligopolistic, what we call oligopolistic in Japan. But we'll also see a fair amount of competition. They're oligopolistic, but actually a fair amount of competition. It's in there. But it's oligopolies in that there's a relatively small number of firms that dominate, say, the majority of an industry. And then this third one is a very interesting one, monopolistic competition. And you say, what is that? How can you have competition in a monopoly? So it's a mixture. It's something that has a mixture of monopoly and competition. And in fact, as we will see, the many industries and if anything, most firms actually in the real world compete under monopolistic competition. So this is a very important. This is a very important. This is a very important type of industrial organization, and as we will see, this is a form that we will that you see a lot. What it basically means is that firms they compete, but they make themselves a little bit different than their competitors, so that they have some monopoly power, but they're in competition. You see that in restaurants, retail, a lot of retail. Retailers is the most common place where we see monopolistic competition, and the way that works is that retailers typically make themselves a little bit different, just a little bit different, so that they can attract people that are looking for a specific thing. Restaurants, why you have restaurants, that French food or Italian food or Thai food, those are forms that they're competing with each other because they're competing in the big restaurant market, but they have a little bit of monopoly pricing power. So that's what happens is that firms actually get a little bit of monopoly pricing power so they have a little bit of market power even though they're competing in a competitive market, but not perfectly competitive. So there is a difference. Excuse me. A monopoly, we'll start with monopoly. We'll spend, I think we're going to spend the whole class here on that. Monopoly is an industry made up of a single firm whose output is a product for which there is no close substitute. That's the very important thing, is that a real monopoly is where there's no close substitute for the product. That's the very important thing to remember. If there's a close substitute, that's monopolistic competition. Restaurants, the close substitute, Thai restaurant is, you can go to a Chinese restaurant, you can go to an Italian restaurant, you can go to a Japanese restaurant. Those are close substitutes. In a monopoly, you don't. You may not have, and the monopoly electricity. Now, electric markets have been, there's now competition in electric markets, but you can think of markets where there is no where there is no competition, and certainly utility markets are traditionally an example of that. So monopolies may exist for one or more of the following reasons. Through operation by a government entity, and I say that because we see that that's something that has taken place in this country. For example, in the tobacco industry, the government ran as a very tight monopoly for many decades. From the early 20th century, the Japanese government operated the tobacco industry as a government monopoly. They controlled both the output prices, they controlled what the farmers grew, they controlled every aspect. They told the farmers exactly how much of what kind of tobacco they grew. They bought their harvest. They manufactured the product, and they sold the product, and also they could erect the barriers to trade in order to prevent foreign firms from coming in and competing with them. So that's the kind of thing that we quite often see, or you can certainly see in there through patent rights. Granted by government. Patent rights are very important. Are a very important thing. Patent right says that if you are the inventor of a product or of a certain type of idea that you can control, patent rights say that you have some exclusive monopolistic right for some period of time, and that way that if you come up with an invention. Quite often, it takes a lot of effort to create an invention. It takes a lot of effort, and so. But once you create it, it's quite often it's easy to be copied. It's easy for somebody to copy an invention once you produce it. So what governments quite frequently do is they grant patent rights to inventors that say that an inventor has an exclusive period, it could be 15, 20 years or so, where they have exclusive right to market that, to sell that product in any way that they wish, which means they can set that price. The inventions throughout many kinds of industries. This is the case. Last semester I talked about my brother's invention. His cold cart, his portable cold storage invention. In fact, he holds patents in a number of countries to protect his invention, and he has a certain number of years in which the invention is protected. So a very common industry that you see that in is in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceuticals, that's drugs and other types of medical products, typically require a great deal of research and development, a great deal of money. Pharmaceutical firms have to spend a great deal of money in order to develop new medicines, new drugs. And so, in order, because of those large costs, in order that the firms can recover their costs, because it's quite often very expensive, both in terms of the research, but also to get government approval for drugs from various government regulators in various countries, that they need a period in which they have monopoly power, in which they can price their product accordingly, in order to recoup their investment costs. So that's a very important right. Through rights provided by a private entity, that refers to basically licensing agreements. What we're talking about here is a firm may come up with an invention and then license, sell that right. For example, if a firm holds a patent, that also gives them the right to license and to give someone, another producer, some right, which can also give them some type of monopoly power in terms of manufacturing the good. This is, and again, you quite frequently see this in the pharmaceutical industry. There's other industries as well, but some very good examples in the pharmaceutical industry. Firms may have firms that focus on research. They come up with a potential product. They may license it. Once they get some type of patent, some type of protection for it, they can license the product. Through a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is a situation where what we mean by a natural monopoly means that an industry that has increasing returns to scale throughout the possible production quantity output, so that at any increasing quantity of output, the average price of production continues to drop. So if you have a situation like that, as soon as one firm gets larger, then their cost of production is lower, and they can drive all of their firms out of an industry. That's called a natural monopoly. We'll look at a model that talks about that. There used to be, people used to say that utilities were a natural monopoly. Changes in technology are changing that. So many economists now think that natural monopolies are not quite as natural as they seem. But certainly the idea was that, for example, telecommunications, and that once a company laid telecommunication lines, the ones that had the biggest network, because of network externalities, network effect, that they had a competitive advantage, and so they could control an entire market. Another example, like electric production. These are where scale economies, electricity production. Another a kind of a natural monopoly is refining of petroleum and petroleum products. Refinery. The bigger the refinery, the lower the cost of production. So you can get either a natural monopoly or some type of. It's a naturally to have one or a very small number of firms. So that's what we mean by a natural monopoly. The next one is through. This is an interesting one. It's one person that I'm interested in a lot because it's a central part of my specialty in economics, urban regional economics, where we consider the effect of spatial distance from other competitors creating a monopoly that's in space, and it has to do that travel time. It takes time to go from one place to another, and so since it takes time, if one seller is closer, then that seller could even have higher prices than one that's further away. So they have so a seller with a market area has a type of monopoly that we call a spatial monopoly. It's a monopoly in space. Go out to any grocery store in your neighborhood. Your grocery store in your neighborhood has a spatial monopoly in the area around the store. We'll talk more about that later. That's an important part of retailing in the bricks and what we call the bricks and mortar retail environment. But it can also be online. In fact, in terms of monopolies, think of Google. Google is almost like a monopoly in the search engine. Why? it's almost like a spatial monopoly because it's easy to find. It's easy to find. Once people found it, then they were bigger. Once it was bigger, they could make better searches, make a better search engine, which meant it was more attractive, which attracted more people, which gave it network economies, which gives it some type of kind of a monopoly. It's a type of it's easier for people to get to. YouTube and other types of services are very similar. These kinds of markets that are online can create a type of monopoly because it's a distance in that it's easy to get to. That's also another type that's another type of distance. We can also see that as distance in virtual space and not just in physical space. So we can talk about spatial monopolies in virtual space as well as in physical space. And finally, another one is the prevention of market entry by potential competitors. This has to do with behavior. The behavior of firms are what's called predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is pricing where a firm undercuts its competitors in order to get a market advantage. And one of the firms that I'll mention a little bit later is Amazon. Amazon is a predatory pricer, and in some ways I think Amazon may not actually, Amazon is people think of it as a dynamic firm, but sometimes I wonder whether it's really dynamic, and it's just a predator. It's a firm that with predatory behavior. That's an interesting question, and I think a very interesting, legitimate question that has to do. We also talk about what are remedies for monopolies. That monopolistic behavior can have a damaging impact. And as we talked about just in the example earlier, the monopolist comes into the market, creates has the monopoly. Everybody is worse off except for the monopolist. Everybody is poor, everybody has lower utility, but the monopolist is making above normal profits, so the monopolist is happy. So there are remedies, there's things that typically are done, that have to be done by the government, some type of government agency or regulator, in order to reduce the negative effects of monopolistic behavior, particularly this kind of behavior where potential competitors adopt predatory behavior to keep competitors out of the market. So we'll go over, we'll examine each of those causes for the existence of a monopoly. I'm very tired. The monster is not, and even the coffee monster is just not working for him today. Which is why we have our video, and you'll see that later. Hope he's okay. We'll talk now about operation by a government entity. I talked about the operation of the tobacco market as an important example in Japan, but really the most important examples of government-run monopolies in the world, and in fact some of the world's largest, larger corporations are oil monopolies that are related to, that are government-run oil monopolies, and these are just some examples of government-run oil monopolies. At least the last figure that I saw, I think this is like a year or two ago, the estimation was that 75% of the world's crude oil production is controlled by government monopolies. I think the biggest is the Saudi Aramco. That, I believe, is the largest, because Saudi Arabia is the world's largest exporter. Not the world's largest producer, but I think the United States is now the largest producer again. But the Saudi Arabia is the largest exporter, and this is the largest petroleum company in the world, I believe, is the Saudi Aramco. This is the one, Venezuela. It has the largest reserves. It's nationalized. Of course, that's part of the problem in that country, is that this has been a very poorly run monopoly. And that is also a problem that you get, is quite frequently, is that these government-run monopolies may be poorly run. This is certainly not the case. I don't think this is the case in countries like this, Kuwait. These are pretty well run monopolies that contribute to the prosperity of these countries. But this is an example where that's not the case. That the Venezuelan monopoly is not the case. Now, one of the things that you asked about this, actually, this is another one. This Pemex is another one that hasn't been really well run, not particularly well run, and I would think it's probably the same for the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. These are, as I say, that can vary. This is a very partial sample. You see Malaysia, Indonesia. But one of the interesting things is you see there's a lot of private oil companies. And so what happens is, in many cases, the private oil companies then work with these monopolies because the private oil companies have the technical expertise. And typically, these governments may not, they may own the companies, but they may not have the technical expertise. And that's certainly, that's probably the case, say, for many of these companies. And so they bring in. They may bring expertise or work with. This is where the private oil companies work with these nationalized government-run corporations. But at any rate, this is a very, very important and probably the best known examples in the world of government-run monopolies. I suppose that that national health care systems are to some extent monopolies, not quite, because even government-run health care, there's private sector, but at least there's some element of a monopoly. Certainly you have that in this country with the national health care system. There's still lots of private, but there's at least some type of, and particularly in terms of purchasing drugs, and purchasing medical equipment, that at least there's some monopolistic power. But anyway, that's just another example. I mentioned tobacco. Another one is the ministry is through the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. There's essentially an effective monopoly on the import of wheat and barley into Japan. And the way this is done is that the government controls the sale of imported wheat, and they sell the imported wheat to domestic users. And they do this at quite a substantial premium to global prices. So the government imports, and the way this works is that the government imports wheat. So your bread, most of your bread though is the source of that wheat is foreign. The government imports that, sells it at sets a monopoly price to manufacturers of bread and other products, and they use the profits then in terms to subsidize. One of the ways they use it is to subsidize producers of wheat. So wheat is grown particularly in Hokkaido. There's wheat production that takes place in Hokkaido. You'll look at like your bread packages. You can find it where it's domestically produced. You'll look on your bread packages or other bakery products, and see where you'll find that the coaxon. You'll see that sometimes. So if you see that, that's typically grown in Hokkaido, which is not a particularly good place. You can grow wheat in a place like that, but it's not, the yields aren't very high. So in order to make that competitive, the government imports the wheat, artificially sets the price through monopoly pricing power, takes the profits, it earns above normal profits, takes that profit and then subsidizes the production of domestic producers of wheat, in which particularly in Hokkaido. So that's how that works. And I'm not arguing whether or not there may be a very good social reason for that. I'm not saying that whether or not the government should do that or not. That is, but there may well be social reasons for doing that. Another important point to make with that is that by raising the price of wheat, it also makes rice relatively more attractive. For example, that if wheat was sold in this country at a world price, if wheat and bread products were sold, bakery products were sold in this country at a world market price, the price would be considerably lower than what you pay at the store, and that would undercut the sale of rice. So that would also reduce the ability of the government to subsidize rice producers. So there's an interconnection there in terms of agricultural policy, of both the artificial raising of wheat prices, both is to prop up the production of wheat, but also to artificially also support, because they're substitutes, wheat and rice are products, they're substitutes, but also to support, the production of rice by domestic farmers. So just to keep that in mind, those are all related, but that is that's something, that is another monopoly that the Japanese government has. Patent rights, I talked about patent rights. That's, as I say, it's a very, very important right. Here was the very first time-specific patent, and this was done in 1414. These have been now around for 600 years. This is the document. This is the actual document in Venice that was done. This is the original patent law that Venice passed in the Venetian legislature passed in 1414. And so the terms under which the Venetian government granted patents to firms in the Republic, and it's listed here. And it also notes that it was a vote of 116 to 10 to pass that. But this is so this has existed for a long time, and I like to show that this is an example. These things aren't new. These things have been around for people who have realized the advantage of these for quite some time. So this apparently was a time-specific patent. Oh no, this was right. Then there was the patent law. It was 1474. You're right. The 1414 was the first patent law, or the first time-specific patent. But this was the first actual patent law. Japan's patent law dates from 1885. As I mentioned, patents are important to economies and science because they encourage inventors to enhance existing technologies. So as I say, the development of an innovation can be considered the same as the short-run operation of a firm where average revenue is less than average cost. So in other words, the problem that a firm faces is that innovation may cause, in the short run, where average revenue is less than average cost. If that's the case, typically, under perfect competition, a firm would choose to shut down. They wouldn't do it because they're experiencing short-run losses. But what this does is it allows a firm to operate under short-run losses, under the knowledge that when they actually develop the product that they have a monopoly, and so they can earn above normal long-run profits to offset the short-run losses. So that is, of course, a very important consideration, and I think quite a legitimate one. Rights provided by a private entity, I mentioned that earlier. I mentioned about the pharmaceutical industries, that industry firms hold patents and other proprietary rights to drugs, and they're often licensed to other pharmaceutical companies. A very common arrangement in the industry. I think the movie industry, entertainment industry, I think the movie industry has a lot of licensing. Media, I think there's a lot of licensing agreements. So I think you'll see that in other industries as well. That type of rights provided by a private entity. I mentioned natural monopolies, talked about utilities, public infrastructure. Oh yes, here's another. Space agencies could be considered a natural monopoly. But the interesting thing is we can see that all of these are kind of beginning, technology kind of changes. And what's interesting is that, as I say, at one time, natural monopolies were thought to be natural forever, but technology is proving in many cases that may not be the case. And space is a very interesting one. The markets for space products are changing. Private firms are going in. SpaceX is a very good example. Elon Musk's firm. There's others that are, I think they're making some really important innovations where they're reusing, they're getting multiple reuse rockets. That dramatically reduces the cost of rockets. These are things that the government-run entities weren't able to come up with, and so private entities are using, because they're more driven by profit motive. They have a profit motive, so they're coming up with these kinds of solutions. And in fact, now government agencies such as NASA, and I would expect JAXA, are using private sector firms in order to reduce their own costs. There's a kind of public-private partnership that's also going on there. And in fact, what's interesting, in many cases you do see with public utilities, these are instances where there can be public-private partnerships of these kinds of infrastructure, which may have been previously national monopolies, but now you can get firms can come in also, and you can get that kind of public-private partnership. So that's another aspect of natural monopolies. The spatial distance from other competitors is, as I say, is a very interesting one. And this is one that I like, because you remember this from last year. Right? This is, if you can tell, that's on top of Fuji-san. That picture is taken on top of. I love that picture because you get it on. This is quite readily defined online. Here they're at the top of highest point in Japan. There's a Benedetto right at the top of the mountain there, and it's lit up too. They've got it, so that to help people buy their. So they're. I wonder where they get the. I wonder if they use solar power. To where does the power come? I guess they use solar power. I didn't think about that before. But there must be solar power, because clearly that's lit up. I don't think it's run by just by battery. There's solar power in the batteries. The thing is that, well, what if you're on top of Fuji-san? What do and you've got the vending machine there. Where's your competitor? If you want a Coke, where's your competition? Your competitor's down at the bottom of the mountain somewhere. So and if you look, you can see it's Gohyaku in there. You can see that price. And part of one of the things that people had said, well, yeah, it's 500 yen because it costs a lot. I asked somebody about this recently. So how do they get those up there? Do you fly them by helicopter? And no, the thing is, they apparently they have the bulldozers that go up the mountain. I've never been up there. I guess before I die, I might. You know, it's said that what is the saying, that you must go up there once and you're an idiot. You know, you're stupid if you go up twice. You know, so but I haven't gone up once yet, so I guess I should, you know, I should do that. But and maybe, and I suppose I'll do it so I can see that. So a lot of times people think, well, it's because it costs a lot. Yes, it costs a lot, but the only reason why you can do that is because there's demand at that price. And there's demand at that price because you can have monopoly pricing. You have monopoly pricing power. So the monopoly pricing power means you can charge the higher price. People are willing to pay for it because they're on top of the mountain, and it's hours and hours. A Coke otherwise is hours and hours away, and they don't have to pack the Coke. They can just go up to the top of the mountain and buy a Coke. And also, if you hike at some of the mountains and hills. What is it? There's the very popular one in the western suburbs here. And I know when you go up the mountain, you get the Jito Hambai. The higher up you go, the price goes higher and higher. Takao. Takao, yeah, right, Takao, right. And you're going up the mountain. It's like at every new level, you're going, oh, the price gets higher. On the, you know, and again, people think it's because, it's because it costs more to take it up there. No. It gets higher because people are willing to pay more.
Yeah. They're putting price on purpose.
Well, it's because of monopoly. It's monopoly pricing power. And the higher up you go, the further you are away. And, you know, if you want it, there it is. That's, you have to pay that. But it also means because you're willing to pay, that's why you have it. If people didn't want to pay gohyaku-yen for a Coke on top of Fuji-san, you wouldn't have it. Any rate, so the prevention of market entry by competitors. This one is this one is a very, as I say, two ways that would be monopolists by their government regulation and or licensing requirements. This is a very common one. It's especially a problem, at least I'm familiar with in the United States. There's a lot of licensing that really is just nonsense that's ordered to restrict competition. The American economy is full of this little stuff. Little, you know, even for like hairdressers and all of these kinds of services. The states have all these licensing requirements, so it's kind of artificial regulation. But you'll see it. A lot of licensing requirements that can restrict competitors. Some of it is nonsense, but some of it is real. For example, licensing doctors. You usually want to go to a licensed doctor because that's your health. I mean, there are unlicensed doctors, I suppose. What do you call naturopaths or chiropractors? That is a different kind of thing. But your medical doctor, you want to, if somebody's doing surgery on you want to know that they're licensed and that they're, the person cutting you up hasn't killed anybody recently, through negligence. It's nice to know, So a lot of that could be very positive. There's going to be a social benefit. Some of it can be a positive, negative. Then I mentioned predatory pricing that drives would-be entrants out of the market in the short run. Predatory pricing behavior is a very important problem in many industries. And as I say, I mentioned Amazon. I'm beginning to think that Amazon is a real, in many of its retail markets, is just a predator. And what Bezos has done is convinced, what Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, has done is convinced investors that they're going to have long-run profits, but in the short run, in many of the retailing areas, that they're just going to increase market share. And so what the investors keep on giving him money in order to, and they're growing and growing and growing, but they're not, at least in their retail activities, they're not earning much profits. So because they don't have to pay, they don't have to earn profits, they don't even have to earn economic profits. They can actually earn like below economic profits because they're essentially being subsidized. Amazon is to some degree being subsidized by, in many of the areas that it competes in, by its investors. And so it can drive out other competitors just because it has this lower, the lower pricing may not be because they're more efficient. It may be just because of they have investors that are waiting when they become a monopoly and control markets. So that's certainly a possibility. If anybody's interested, that would be might be an interesting area to look into. Is Amazon? That's an interesting question. Is Amazon a predatory pricer? Is it a predatory company, or is it just an innovator? So those are legitimate questions, and the reason is that if Amazon is an innovator, then they're going to expand economic growth by growing and becoming more efficient. But if they're just a predator, then actually they're going to be stifling innovation and actually driving other companies out of business and reducing overall social welfare. So that's also a possibility. So those are certain things, and those are the things that governments have a legitimate role in a modern economy. Is asking those questions. At any rate, now we'll talk about government regulation and licensing requirements. The very classic examples of government-sanctioned monopoly, and one of the best ones in the U.S. was AT&T, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. It grew very. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, there were a lot of competitors in the field, in the telecommunication field. But by the early 20th century, AT&T had become the dominant firm, and it was because of natural monopolies. The declining average costs, you had increasing returns to scale. The industry experienced increasing returns to scale once AT&T got bigger. Then it drove all the other competitors out of the market, and eventually became a monopoly. When that happened, then the government said, "Okay, we were going to regulate you. You'll allow you to operate as a monopoly, but we have the right to control your price and to regulate your price, and we also have the right to tell you that you have to provide universal service." So that was how the U.S. government did. I believe that was in 1919. I believe that was in 1919 that the U.S. government regulated AT&T and said, you can be a monopoly, you can operate as a monopoly, but we can control your price. We have some control over your price. You have to get approval for price increases. And you have to provide a service to everybody. So in other words, they had to, for some users, they had to extend telecommunication lines into rural areas and hard-to-service areas at a loss, so they could operate as a monopoly, charge monopolistic prices, use that to what's called cross-subsidize. That was cross-subsidize. So AT&T, they higher prices, they could use some of their profits to pay for the construction of infrastructure in areas where, in fact, their revenues were going to be less than operating costs. Rural areas, for example. So, for the social benefit of everyone having telecommunication, a telephone service. So, and that happened until the 1980s. 1980s, the telecommunication industry was deregulated in the United States. A very big, major event, and in fact, it's led to modern. Now, the telecommunication industry is very much more fragmented, much more complex. NTT is the example here in this country. NTT was a government-sanctioned monopoly. It was established as a government-owned corporation in 1952. 1952, it was privatized in 1985. Privatized in 1985, it's interesting, you think about it, it was 32 years it was a monopoly, and that was 32 years ago. So now the existence of NTT, where now half of it has been under privatization. But the interesting thing there is the government still owns a fair, reasonable percentage of the shares of NTT, I believe. Another one is the agricultural government-sanctioned monopoly is J. Zenshu. It has a very, it's basically an extension of the MAF, Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. It had an effective monopoly in the collection of rice and the sale of farm machinery and fertilizers. Some of that has been deregulated in the 1980s and 1990s, but it's still an important part of the fabric of life in rural parts of this country, even today. Let's see. I'm talking about that's a little bit. I need to check and see if that's whether there's an update. If anybody has an update, I'm thinking of checking that out. That was about a year ago or so. There was that situation. I haven't checked on that recently. If anybody knows, just let me know. This the situation of J. Zenshu. I mentioned the predatory pricing. Yeah. So I've already talked about that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to, let's see, I'm going to go over, now let me just check the time here. Let's see what we have. We've got about 30 minutes, so we're fine. And we're all here now. We're going to talk about, I'm going to do a graphical analysis of a pure monopoly. And a pure monopoly is the only firm operating in the industry. Since the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve, the pure monopolist has market power. An interesting point is that since it has market power, it does not have a supply curve. At least a supply curve if there's only and so the firm focuses on manipulating its price and output in order to maximize its profit. The important thing to remember is that the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, perfect competition, flat demand curve, marginal revenue is constant. Marginal revenue is not constant for the monopolist, and so its marginal revenue. It's the pure monopolist is concerned with how its marginal revenue varies with output level. So it's concerned about marginal revenue and output level, where the perfectly competitive firm faces a constant marginal revenue curve, is concerned with how its cost varies with its output level. Both the perfectly competitive, but the important thing to remember is the profit maximization is the same behavior. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Remember, that never changes. That's an important thing to remember. Marginal cost always, the profit maximizing firm, whether it's a monopoly or perfect competition, whatever type of organization it operates under, it makes that same choice. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue. The difference is the marginal cost equals marginal revenue, downward sloping marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive, for a monopolist or a firm with market power, downward sloping marginal revenue curve. The perfectly competitive firm has a flat marginal revenue curve. So that's the thing. So pure monopolies will work with and without price discrimination. I'm just going to talk briefly about price discrimination. Price discrimination means when firms can identify which of their customers are willing to pay more for their output and charge such customers accordingly. So price discrimination. Have you ever, has anyone ever shopped in like if you go to certain countries, you can go and you barter. For example, if you go to Middle Eastern countries, you'll tip. There's no price. You'll go and you'll say that you're interested in some good. I want to buy this. I don't know if I'm really interested. But you may be very interested, but you might say about how little interest you have. Or they might say, well, first they'll say, well, you might ask what the price is, and then they'll quote some ridiculous price, some price, and then you'll say, no, I don't know. And then you'll start what's called haggling. Do you know the term haggling? Haggle? In English term, haggle. Haggle means that you barter, you negotiate the price. Now, obviously, in a lot of things we negotiate the price, but we're talking about just buying anything. You see this very common in the Middle East. Do you do that? Is that China? Do you have any? Is there any haggling? Not really, is there?
Negotiation price.
No, it's a set price. I'm trying to think of other. Where else? Oh, of course, if you go to like Bangkok and the street markets, that's you haggle. You'll go if you go to like if you go like the markets on Sukhumvit. If you know Bangkok, there's a main street in what's now the center of the city, and there's vendors all along the street, and you go and there's no price. You just start. Typically, you just start negotiating, and the reason is that the purpose of that is that the vendor wants to price discriminate. The vendor is trying to price discriminate because if they want to sell it at the price that you're willing to pay rather than some market equilibrium. Okay, so that's what price discrimination is you can say, you want that bad. You're some guy that wants this really bad. Let me just erase this. I'm going to erase this here. So let's say, you're on there's some market demand curve. So say suppose there's some downsloping market demand curve, X. And maybe there would be some equilibrium if there was a market, and it might be, let's say, there. And but the thing is that if you were say a vendor and you see somebody walking up that really wants it bad, if you can tell that that's where they're at, why should you sell it at some market price when they're willing to pay that? I mean, why? That's the point. So that's what haggling is about. That you want to catch the vendor wants to find that person that's willing to pay more, and it could be just because of ignorance of prices, especially for tourists. This is really good for tourists because tourists are usually willing to pay more anyway. They're on holiday. Tourists are on holiday. They're willing to pay more. They're having a good time. They're worried less about their elasticity of demand. The demand is less elastic. It's more inelastic. That's what tourists. The great thing about tourists, the demand is more inelastic. They have less knowledge about. They don't have knowledge about local market prices, practice. There's a lot of lack of information. So of course, that's what you try to take advantage of if you were a seller, a vendor in such a situation. Another way is in the airline industry. The airline industry is pretty sophisticated doing price discrimination, and that's why, like, if you buy in advance, you may buy at a lower price, but under certain conditions. And I assure you, if you walk up 10 minutes, if you walk up and the plane is full, and the plane's leaving in 10 minutes, it's not, and you have enough money in your pocket, the plane's not full anymore. There's room for you. You know, so that's, but that's because if you're coming to the last minute and you have to get on, you're willing to pay more. You're willing to pay more. So those prices, those prices vary. So at any rate, that's what price discrimination is, and we'll talk first without pure monopoly, and by pure monopoly I mean just in fact a single firm. And this is what we've talked about before. It is in fact the same graph as was noted earlier. I have to make sure that's page 19. But this is exactly the same graph as we showed before. But now I'm showing a few more things. I'm showing the perfect competition outcome here. I'm showing here's the profit the firm makes. Here's what's called the consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is that point above the price where there are consumers that would be willing to pay more. They would be willing to pay more, but they don't have to. So those consumers experience, because they're willing to pay more, but the price is lower, this is the benefit that goes to the consumer. The profit is the benefit, is the gain to the monopolist. Of course, we have the downward sloping marginal revenue curve. We set marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here, the marginal cost is 7. We're just assuming a flat marginal cost of 7. Marginal cost equals marginal revenue 6.5. Remember 6.5 and 13.5 as the 13.5 the price up here. That's the market price there. This is the consumer surplus. All of this is consumer surplus. This is a pure loss. This is what's called a pure loss. This is what's called a loss to society, because the society completely loses this. The firm doesn't get this either. The firm does not get this because the firm is producing at this level. So the firm doesn't get that, but the firm gets the profit. Firm's still happy. Firm is getting real profits. These are above normal profits. Happiness for the firm, loss to the society, some gain for those people that are willing to pay the higher. There are people that are willing to pay the higher price, and because the demand curve is downward sloping. So that's as I say, it's the same figure, but we've put all these other things as well. Now I'm going to talk about pure monopoly with price discrimination. And again, I don't want to go too much into this. I just want to introduce you to this idea. The pure first degree price discrimination means the monopolist can discriminate every single customer along the demand curve. It's like some guy that's selling carpets at some bazaar in Istanbul can tell everybody who comes in exactly what they're willing to pay and get that price from them if in fact they're willing to pay a price equal to or above what the seller is willing to sell. That's called first degree price discrimination. This is the holy, if you're a retailer, first degree price discrimination is what we call the holy grail. Do you know the term holy grail? I'll give you the whole Holy Grail was the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table in British folklore. I think King was like the 8th or 9th century AD, so about 1,200 years ago. And there was the story was he and his knights were looking for the Holy Grail, this magical grail that had all these magical properties. So when we say in English the Holy Grail, it comes from that King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table that were looking for this magic thing. It may not really exist. Well, the Holy Grail for retailers the retailer's holy grail is to be able to price discriminate with in the first degree with every customer. So that every customer that comes in, you look at them and you say, I know what you want to pay. You're going to pay that. You want to pay that? Well, that's the price for you. Oh, you want to pay that? Well, that's the price for you. That's the, yeah, you can have it at that price. That's okay. So under here, all of this is what's interesting, and what's interesting about the price discrimination profit, a pure monopoly with first-degree price discrimination, is that the monopolist actually produces to the point of perfect competition. The reason is that they can earn profits to the last person. They don't have to reduce their output, because if somebody wants to pay this, they just charge them that. And if they want to pay this, they charge that person that. And that last one absolutely won't pay anything. There will, because that's equal to their marginal cost. And they'll sell it to them. And the important thing here is that you have some way to protect that. It could be information, it could be time, some type of thing that gives the seller an advantage. In this case, because the interesting thing is, from a societal standpoint, the society gets the perfect competitive output, but the firm gets all of the profit. The firm gets all of the consumer surplus. So that's what's happening. So you get the social gain, except the firm gets all of it. So that's what happens under under pure price discrimination. Is that potentially? And one of the interesting things is the internet does give more opportunity for price discrimination. You can, because people want something. If you want it now, then there's a price that can be higher than You can find out you get some sense of how badly somebody wants something. So you have a lot of auctions and stuff online that can try to achieve that. So the consumer surplus, in fact, there's no consumer surplus loss. There is no consumer surplus loss. It's just the firm takes it all. The firm under perfect first-degree price discrimination gets all of the consumer surplus. I'm just going to talk. Let's see. I think you may just want to read this. This is kind of technically that a natural monopoly, the concept of the mathematical concept of sub-additivity. It's present when there's a function consisting of two elements, and with the result of summing both elements of the function together produces a result less than or equal to the result of summing the elements separately. So this is some kind of, so what you're talking about is some, it's mathematically a way to describe increasing returns to scale. So if something is sub-additive, you get this type of thing where the adding them together is that the function is less than or equal, like cost. This is as a cost function of increasing the size is less than separate. So that's called sub-additivity. So a natural monopoly is present if the cost function of potential industry members, if potential industry members are sub-additive. So that's just something to keep in mind, that is what that is. So just keep that in mind. I don't think there's anything. I'm not going to ask you that, but just mathematically, that is what's going on. I'm now going to, and I'll be introducing this. We're going to spend more time going through this. It's going to take a fair bit of the next class session to go through this, but we'll be able to introduce this next section. I'm going to talk about natural monopoly. as I said, natural monopolies may or may not exist in, we're not sure. But it certainly is an interesting example where we can look at some behavior and start modeling behavior of firms under such conditions that kind of can give a little bit of a flavor about how the real world works. The real world where there's kind of monopolistic behavior and that type of thing. We often in economics make use of games to study interaction between firms. Now you'll notice the thing that I talked about at the beginning of the class, I kind of framed it in terms of a game where the monopolist comes in, sets the price, the monopolist knows the impact, knows that in fact it doesn't have an incentive to, even though firms want to come and are willing to take lower wages. And so it's like labor is knocking on the door, please hire us, we're willing to take a lower wage. Well, but I'm not going to increase my output, so, go away. I guess you could have some type of game. There could be a game, and also a game in terms of the wages that you pay. You have to pay to your workers as well. That's an interesting point. I have to think about it. But that point is it's laid out as a game, and the actions of the monopolist, and that they don't have to increase their production because they know they don't have to because they're going to maintain some type of, or they have some natural monopoly. I think we are running out of time. That's right. It's not 15 minutes. It is 2 minutes. We have 2 more minutes. So, I think that's just it. I'm just going to introduce the concept of game theory. And game theory is where we look at game, where basically that you play on your computer or mobile phone. Basically, you have objectives and rules. That's what games are. Players have objectives and they have rules. And so in economics, we look at a lot of what's called game theory. We look at a lot of economic interaction in terms of players playing games where there are rules and where there are objectives. And so what we're going to do is use that kind of framework, the framework of a basic game, in order to analyze the behavior of two firms in a natural monopoly, in a situation where there's potentially, or where there's a natural monopoly. And we're going to go through, we're going to set up the rules, and then we're going to let the players play the game and see what the outcome is. And then, and what economists often do is we use those kind of games to tell us, well, that's how the real world works. Because if you go out, for those of you who ever get involved in business, I assure you business is a game anyway. It's a game where people get up in the morning and they're playing, it's a game, you're playing a game. You're trying to figure out, you're competing, you're trying to outsmart your competitor, certain people go in and they try to legally steal money from corporate balance sheets, steal money legally from investment bankers, legally steal money from their customers, insurance companies legally steal money from their, that's all game, it's all games. And the fun is if you're depending on where you're at. So games in fact work, and there's a lot of ways in which the world really works. So we'll talk more about that next time. But I think I've introduced you've got this already. So just go over this, and so we'll be talking about this game next time in class. Thank you.